If you want to fly fish in Alaska, here's a bunch of tips that I have for you. After a bunch of recent trips that we took to Alaska, here's what I would suggest you bringing, you not bringing, things to consider, that sort of thing. Number one is if you're going to Alaska, you need to realize it's going to be very cold. So the gear is going to be absolutely imperative that you stay dry. It rains a lot in Alaska, and sometimes it rains on days that you don't think it's going to rain. And being dry is your number one thing. You're going to want to be dry. Even in the summer months of Alaska, July and August, it can be very, very cold, and it can be very rainy and windy. So bring gear so that you can be dry. I like my Simms jacket. It's a waterproof jacket. The size of that is one size bigger than I wear. Like if I wear a size large sweatshirt, I'm gonna wear a size XL Simms jacket. I just like the red color of those Simms jackets, and it's got everything I need in the pockets, and it's just built for fishing. It's got a really big wide hood. That's really important for when you're fishing so that you don't get water in your face. But be prepared for cold and be prepared for rain. Just bring more gear than you think you need. If you have holes in your waders, I would patch those or get a new set of waders because that water is extremely cold. A lot of that water is coming straight down from the glacier, and you need to have good gear when you go up there, so don't be cheap on your gear. Now, what kind of fly rod do you need? If you're gonna fly fish for salmon, I would say 8 weight is the minimum weight that you're gonna want. 10 weight is a great all-around fly rod weight. 12 weight is a little bit overboard, but I would say an 8 weight or a 10 weight. When we went fly fishing for salmon, we used 8 weights. I would get the longest rod possible, so a 9-foot 6-inch. If you could get a 10-footer, that would be great, just because you're gonna be fishing lots of water and vast, wide open rivers that are gonna be super wide and probably a lot bigger than you're used to fishing. A lot of times people will bring spey rods up there. I won't get into that. I'm not a real big spey guy, but you can fly fish for salmon with a spey rod, which is which is another part of the sport that I'm not very familiar with. So you can get into that, but I just use a floating line or a sink tip line that I attach to my floating line. You're fishing 8 weight, you're fishing 10 weight. And fluorocarbon leader, it can be mono, it could be fluorocarbon, but you're looking at 8 pound, 10 pound, 12 pound. You could even go up to 15, 20 pounds. I know a lot of the guys who are fishing gear, they're putting like 20 pound tippet on there, 20 pound line. For salmon, they're generally not leader shy, so it's more about them being really aggressive, especially silver salmon. Those things are super aggressive, so don't worry too much about the size of tippet that you have. But 8 pound is probably a little light. I'd go 10 to 20 pounds somewhere in there, and you're good to go. 15 is a good, nice fluorocarbon set to have. So bring a variety of tippets, but 15 pound, you're probably gonna be fine. The next thing is bears. There are grizzly bears everywhere in Alaska, except for Southeast Alaska. It's a little bit different. Their bears are different. They're smaller, and there's not as many grizzly bears there, but you need to be aware of bears, right? If you're camping, especially, don't put food inside your tent. Don't put open food inside your car. They can get into it. They will get into those Yeti coolers that you think are bear proof. Just be very careful around them and make a lot of noise when you're walking in through the woods. You want to make sure you're making noise for bears so that you can scare those things away, because nobody wants to run into a grizzly bear, especially if you frighten one with young cubs. You just need to be very careful. Just being able to know that they're around making noise and traveling in big groups of people is very critical. Please don't go off on your own. That would be very gutsy. People do it, but I generally think it's not very safe to do. Okay, if you want to catch salmon, a lot of times just hire a guide the first time you go up there. It's going to be a lot less frustrating, and you're going to have a lot better time. These guides know exactly where the fish are or tend to hang out. A lot of times when you get a pot of fresh fish that's coming up the river, those guides are going to know exactly where they were yesterday and where they're going to be today and probably the next day after that. They're going to know, are they high up in the river, in the middle of the river? We went up to Alaska and we spent days searching for salmon, and we didn't even touch it. I think we saw one dead, what they called it, an old boot salmon, which is like a salmon that's like half dead. We saw one salmon the entire river system, and there's lots of fish in there, and that fishing can be fantastic, but in that river at that time of year, if the fish aren't fresh or there isn't a lot of fresh rain, it is going to be very difficult to find those fish. So hire a guide, I would say, at least your first day that you're there, so that you don't go home empty-handed and just do a Alaskan fly fishing trip where you're practicing casting, which is pretty much what we did the first day. Now, one of these days we took a charter flight out, and we actually got really lucky because a whole pot of fresh fish came in, and we started catching silver salmon left after right. And I would say the biggest thing is that you're gonna look for ripples on the top of the water. That is where schools of fish are, especially when it's like shallower water. You can find those fish via like little ripples little rings and ripples on the top of the water. That's how we found them. But once you find those fish, it's generally like just a heyday of just catching fish over and over. You're gonna put your fly line out there and you're gonna strip just as aggressively as you can, as fast as you can. Short little strips, and you're gonna be able to catch a lot of salmon like we did. Again, I would have 15-pound fluorocarbon knots on there. It doesn't really matter which knot you tie, just before you get that fly out there, make sure you test it a whole bunch of times. The other thing you need to know is that salmon aren't always everywhere in the river. They are very spread out and they're in pockets. Generally, they're in pockets of fish. When they first come out of the saltwater, they're gonna come in just all in one big group, and then they're gonna kind of group up. So not everywhere in the river is going to have fish just evenly spread out. That's very rare. A lot of times they're kind of, especially in the mid or upper parts of the river, they're going to be socketed up into these little pockets. So you may go from pocket to pocket. That's why it's better to hire a guide and have a drift boat or some sort of power boat, so you can go hit different holes throughout the river, so you're not just stuck waiting and you can only fish about 5 holes. Whereas if you're fishing with a guide, let's say they have a drift boat, you're fishing 20, maybe 25 holes, and 5 of those might have fish. The other 20 may not have maybe any fish in them whatsoever. Another thing about going to Alaska is if you want to do these extended trips or take a float plane out to a remote location, going with a group of guys, let's say 6 different people, 8 different people, is going to be a lot more cost effective because you can split the costs of that charter, of the fish processing. You can have, it's safer for bears outside. So going with a bigger group of people generally is going to be a lot more cost effective for you to go. Now, do you need a net when you're in there? I would say no. If you're fishing for salmon, especially like silver salmon, sockeye salmon, you do not need a net. Now, the difference between fishing sockeye salmon and silver salmon is so different that the techniques are different, the flies are different, and that kind of thing. Fishing for sockeye salmon is a whole nother game. This video is pretty much targeted towards silver salmon because that's what I have the most experience doing. And to be honest with you, those fish are a little bit bigger and they're a lot more fun to catch. I think everybody just has a part in their heart about silver salmon fishing. And when you're fishing for silvers, you generally don't need a net. You can just grab the back of their tail once they're tired out and then do whatever you're gonna do with them. Most people are keeping these, so they're throwing them on the bank and doing that sort of thing, but grab them by the tails. You generally don't need a net. Now, if you're on a boat, of course, you're gonna want a net, but if you're just walking and waiting, don't bring a big net. It's just gonna get in the way. Now, what flies are you gonna use for this? I have a whole bunch of different flies that I have tied up. Generally, most of these don't really matter. You don't need to have a huge selection of flies. I would say get a group of flies that you think is gonna work based on my recommendations, and then get them with varying weights. I would say take one fly, like the Dalai Lama, and take different weights of it so that you can have different scenarios. If you're fishing really deep holes, deep pockets that are 10 feet deep, you're gonna want something that's gonna sink very, very fast. If you want something, generally you're gonna want these to have just a little bit of weight, but not too much weight. And what I mean by that is just, I used to wrap lead around the heads of it so I could get it to sink down, but what I found is that's really hard to cast, and if you have too much weight, that fly is gonna sink too fast. So a little bit of weight is good because you can let it sink, or you can have a sink tip on there to get it to sink faster, but too much weight is actually a bad thing. That's one mistake I made when I tied up a bunch of flies for the trip, is I tied them with too much weight. So here are a couple of flies that I tied up. Like green chartreuse, doesn't even have a name, but it has a little barbell. This is the right amount of weight. It just has that one weight on there. And then it has 2 different tails on it for a little bit more action. Something about silver salmon in the action of the fly that they have, they really, really like. Another one, I think this is called the Dalai Lama. This is probably the #1 fly that I would recommend. It has a bead head on here, or a cone head basically. It's got little eyes on it, a little bit of flash. I don't really think that matters. You can go double hook. A lot of these places only allow single hook, so put the single hook in the back. I think this is like about a size 4 hook in there. Barbless or unbarbless, check your regulations there. You can tie them in different colors. Again, this is just a variation. This has some marabou to just give it a little bit more pulse. I really like these leeches that have the really bright colored heads on them because it seems to attract the fish, just in my opinion, a little bit better. But this has got really good action on it. You can tie them in purple. You can tie them the same ones in pink. The pink color seems to do really well. So different colors of pink, light pink, tan pink. One really nice thing about this is that you can also dead drift these too, because it looks like flesh. It looks like a lot of times when these guys are fly fishing for salmon, especially later in the year, they're using beads for the egg representation. They're also using flesh patterns that you can just dead drift down. And so sometimes those fish are keyed, those rainbows especially, are keyed in on the flesh. So sometimes you can pick up a rainbow trout with that. But here's another one. It's actually a pretty cool pattern. It's got some flash. It looks like it's got like kind of a fire pattern to it. This is one I just made up by myself. I wanted a little bit more weight, so I put a pink bean in the front, and I put the cone of the head I actually put backwards, so it looks like it's almost eating the cone. Not really sure if this has worked. Never caught any fish on that one, but I would say these dollies are going to be your number one pattern. Just tie up a whole bunch of these. If you had just one pattern, I would tie them up. This one, I didn't. You can glue this on the bottom, so it's just one piece. But I actually had this like this because it just gives a little bit more pulsing in the water, a little bit more action. And when you're stripping it really fast, I think the fish like that action where it's moving up and down. So just kind of a very interesting pattern, very simple, very easy. You could be a beginner fly tyer and tie this up real easy. But that is the fly that I would recommend for silver salmon, specifically in Alaska. If you have any questions about where to go, reach out to me. Leave a comment on where to go, what flies to use. If you have any other questions, maybe I missed something in this video about fly fishing in Alaska. Alaska is a huge state. There's lots of places to fish, and it depends on what species you're going to target. This video is more for silver salmon, but if you're going to target rainbow trout, totally different video, totally different topic. Chum salmon, sockeye salmon, that is kind of a different animal. King salmon is a totally different topic. Unfortunately, the kings in a lot of the rivers aren't doing so well, so that's kind of a thing maybe of the past. I know fly fishing is nice because you can do a little bit of catch and release and catch them a little bit more than if you're going to keep them. I think the limits on king salmon, if you are even allowed to target them, is very, very low. So anyway, if you like this video, give me a subscribe and leave in the comment what you want to see more of. So whatever videos you want to see more of, fly fishing Alaska, fly fishing rainbows in Alaska, whatever you guys have. I do have some experience with fishing rainbows in Alaska. We caught a 10-pound, like a legitimate 10-pounder years ago. This was when I was much younger, caught a big rainbow up there, and it's just a fantastic experience. So if you guys want a video on that, let me know, and thanks for watching.